Welcome to Gradcast, the official podcast of the Society of Graduate Students at the University of Western Ontario.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Gradcast, the official radio show and podcast of the Society of Graduate Students here at the University of Western Ontario. Today we're airing live from CHRW 94.9 FM. I'm joined by my co-host Jina. How are you today, Jina?
I'm very well. How are you, Tyson?
I'm not doing too bad. I just realized I didn't introduce myself. I'm Tyson, the host today. So thanks everybody for tuning back in. Today we're joined by Jordan Van Dyke. Jordan, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks.
And what do you do, Jordan?
I'm a master's student in the computer science department.
Okay, awesome. So what specifically do you do in computer science?
I look at cryptocurrencies and graphs mostly. So a graph as a mathematical context, not as a bar graph as you would think in Excel or something. And what I'm trying to look is for just exploratory research into information we can glean from the transactions that are occurring within a cryptocurrency.
So cryptocurrencies being like Bitcoin, Dogecoin, these kind of things, right?
Correct. They're a currency that uses encryption to do a proof of work concept so that it's completely decentralized, no central bank that can be like, oh, I'm going to flood the market with, $10 million or $10 billion or whatever.
Awesome. So one major question that comes to my head right away is there any sort of regulatory body for these types of currency? So are they even considered currency?
Well, that's the real question. I guess like the big banks don't want to consider them currency at all, but they obviously have a vested interest in it not being considered currency. But realistically, anything that can be traded for any actual, finite object can be considered a currency. And the first pizza bought with bitcoins was somewhere upwards of 10,000 bitcoins, which would be an absurd amount of money in today's prices. But that was what first allowed it to have an actual value. And since then, it's gone up and down like any other currency would.
Do you know the current trading price of a single Bitcoin? Just even roughly?
A few weeks ago, it was still around 300. I think it's about 263 at the moment.
Okay, so you can get parts of a Bitcoin then. You can
yes,
get,
of course.
A tenth or 100.
So the lowest piece that you can trade is actually called a Satoshi, which is the person who wrote the paper, which they have no idea who this guy is. He wrote it under a pseudonym Nakamura Satoshi, and they named the smallest piece after him, and it's I believe right now it's 1/1000th of a Bitcoin is the smallest that you can trade.
Wow. So that's, what, like 1,000th of a cent?
About that, yeah.
Wow. That's amazing. So specifically you analyze the graphs that come from transaction histories.
Correct,
with these
yeah.
cryptocurrencies. I want to ask about the graphs, but I don't want to go too deep. I am a math geek, so I know more about the graphs. But have you been able to glean any information from them?
We have basic information right now. Nothing that's jumped out as being, oh, that's incredibly interesting. But I guess with any sort of exploratory research, most of the times you're kind of looking for that black sheep, something that stands out that you didn't expect. So I guess if everything goes exactly how I expected, I just have to dig deeper and deeper until I find something that's more interesting.
So what drew you to these cryptocurrencies?
The computer science backgrounds with the cryptocurrency is actually incredibly interesting. There's so many algorithms and things that have to work behind the scenes, like all the networks, all the mining networks, the encryption standard itself, like whether or not it can be broken or not. Also the fact that I find our current bank system to be very antiquated. It's very strange to me, like that somebody selling and bundling together mortgages can accidentally collapse the entire U.S. economy, for example, which with a cryptocurrency would never truly happen.
Awesome. So what are your plans after you finish up with your master's? PhD, or are you going to try to get right into the job market?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It's a million Bitcoin, not question.
Oh.
True. I'm not entirely sure. I have leaned towards considering doing a PhD, and to be quite honest, I think it'll be more be determined on how the rest of my research goes. If it goes really well, and I think that there is more that I can look for, or perhaps I find something else that I could roll into a PhD, then I would continue on that way. Otherwise, I'd probably look for a job somewhere.
Okay, so you just get right into the computing game, you know, Microsoft or Apple or one of these guys.
Microsoft is one that I would love to work for. I have a couple friends that work there, and it seems like a great place to work.
So I have a couple questions regarding Bitcoins.
Sure.
So where do these Bitcoins come from, and how can we get our hands on a Bitcoin?
Okay, so if you personally wanted to get your hands on one right now, you'd have to go to an exchange. So what you would do or have somebody transfer you one directly. So you do it in an exchange is you would then pay Canadian dollars, and you would have your Bitcoin address, and they would transfer you a Bitcoin. You would transfer them whatever the price in Canadian dollars is in. You can technically mine coins as well, but in today's day and age, with someone just getting into Bitcoins now, it's not really feasible. And how mining it works is it's a proof of work concept, so you basically have to continuously crack these mathematical codes that become more and more and more difficult to crack. When Bitcoins first came out, you could do it with just your home computer. And then it blew up to having to have multiple graphics cards. And then people started making chips specifically only made for mining Bitcoin. And then they had warehouses of those chips and so on and so forth. So the amount of hash power that's actually being put into just mining the Bitcoins has gone up at an exponential rate. The way that it's set up is that a block, which is its transaction ledger, as long as a block is not being solved more than every 10 minutes, then the difficulty of the Bitcoin will stay the same. If it starts being solved faster than that, they increase what's called the nonce, which is how many zeros in front of this long string of random characters has to be determined before the block is considered solved.
I have a question to follow up on that. So basically it's trying to almost attempt to tie inflation to Moore's law then.
Correct, yes.
And as most people who study computer science then will know that Moore's law is planning to, or is going to be evening out probably in the next 2 decades or so. Now, do you, mathematically, could you see what would be the future of mining at that point, or do you think then you'd end up with deflation or something like that?
Bitcoins is interesting because right from the get-go, we already knew how many Bitcoins were going. The way that the model of Bitcoins is set up is there's only going to be 21 billion or million Bitcoins in total circulation once it's fully mined. At that point, the miners will then take a small fee from every transaction that occurs. So right now, a transaction fee you don't have to push it through, and most miners will push your transaction to the Bitcoin blockchain regardless of whether or not you choose to give them a transaction fee. In the future, however, the entire reason for mining will be that they can collect the fees.
So the fees will then go back into the system that can be then mined out, or what do you
the fees will then be transferred to whoever solved the block, and most of the block solvers are large pools of people, so they would collect all the fees and then transfer them among their pools of whoever was adding the most hash power to it. So where it is right now is when you solve a block, the system actually awards you a block reward. It started at 50 Bitcoins, it's now down to 25. It will half again around 2018, I think, or 2016, depending on how fast the hash power goes up, to 12.5, and then from again it'll get halved again until eventually there are no more Bitcoins left to be mined.
And that'll probably happen before we end up with, what's the term, the quantum issue with CPU power and such like that?
That's Moore's law itself is an interesting thing because Intel was always saying, we're not sure if we can make things smaller, and they were saying that at 90 nanometers, and then they went to 45 and 22 and 13, and I think they have some working ones at 6 or 7 now, which is pretty crazy if you consider how small that actually is compared to a red blood cell even.
So if there is a set number of Bitcoins that can be mined, if they've completely been mined in the future, for example, would their worth go up?
Yes, and so because of that, the fractional portion of the Bitcoin that you can then trade would become larger. In the sense that right now we can trade 1/billionth of a Bitcoin, it would then become slightly slightly smaller amounts that you could trade smaller and smaller amounts that you're not trading away $10,000 worth of something in one shot.
Yeah, it's called deflation. It's the opposite of what happens with currency today. If you hear your grandmother speak and say that you could go to the movies with the bus and popcorn for a quarter in 1937, and now that would be a $30 journey. it's the opposite. So like the bitcoins are going to become more and more valuable as more and more transactions are used by the exact same amount of currency that's static. So yeah, as you said, like it'll be like the pennies becoming more useful as time moves along.
Precisely.
So one major question that comes to mind is, given the lack of regulation around this currency, there must be a huge amount of people using it for illegal purposes. Like I know I heard about Silk Road. Like, what could you tell me about Silk Road?
About Silk Road itself, or about whether or not bitcoins are used for illegal purposes?
How about just some interesting case studies of where it's been used? Because I mean, the Argentina example is really cool as well.
Yeah, there have been situations with Argentina and with China example where people are transferring their money from their country's currency into bitcoins, essentially to shelter it from the banks of their country taking percentages off of it. And as for Silk Road, I mean, Dread Pirate Roberts just recently has been gone through the whole court proceedings, and I think is upwards of 60 years of, or whatever the maximum they considered, so many life sentences of jail based on the fact that he allowed this market. And he didn't create the market saying, everyone come here and trade drugs and, you know, hitmen and stuff like that. He created a free market where being like, you can trade whatever you want on here. And, well, there are no other markets for things like that, so people tended to trade drugs and etc. I'm sure there are a ton of, you know, drug cartels that use Bitcoin, but there are also a ton of drug cartels that use a lot of other things. So just because something's being used for something doesn't inherently make it evil.
Yeah, that brings to mind the whole the Manhattan Project is what I'm looking for. When they were first starting, is it the Manhattan Project? Yes. When they were first starting to come up with the idea for nuclear energy, immediately they thought it can be used for evil, but it can be used for good. An idea isn't inherently one way or the other.
Exactly.
It depends on the application the specific person wants to use it for.
Exactly.
So are the transactions being used in any particular sectors today?
Well, that's the catch. Is Bitcoin is completely anonymous. So the only transaction that you can actually tell exactly what they were being used for is if you knew both of the public addresses. So let's say I'm, you know, myself, and I publish that my address is whatever. It's a 160-bit string, and Tyson here, he publishes that, and then somebody notices that our two addresses had an exchange of, you know, 25 bitcoins or something. That's the only information they can ever glean. Now, if I had another address and I never told anyone what the public version of that is, I could then buy something or trade bitcoins to another address, and all you can see is the money transferring hands. You can't actually see who it's being transferred to or from. Only it's from an address. So
this is the crypto part of the cryptocurrency.
Correct. Right? Yeah.
So what bit encryption does it use? Just out of curiosity.
It's using SHA 256. So
in English, please.
256 bits, a bit being either a 1 or a 0. How can I guess that's a really hard concept to explain, I guess, if you don't have a little bit of background in math. It's like a one-way function, so it's really easy to go one direction to create the encrypted product. It's incredibly difficult to go the other direction.
Isn't it? Doesn't it come down to the difference between exponentiation and logarithms?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so it's easy to raise 2 to the 4, but it's hard to figure out what log 4 of 2 is. Well, that's a bad example, but it's easy to raise 2 to the 10,000, but it's hard to figure out what log base 2 of 10,000 is quickly.
Yeah, I remember hearing computers have a very hard time doing that kind of mathematics, and that's why
there's no
like
good
all
model.
sorts of encryption uses that. Like that's like what banks and stuff use. But then also, I remember there's an upset because people are talking about qubits can solve these extremely quickly.
So the idea with quantum bits, it's not really a huge issue. It's funny because when quantum became even an idea and that we were going to have quantum computers, the people doing crypto research had already solved the problem. And they're like, okay, so let's say it used to be O to the 7th or something to solve something, big O to the 7. Now they'll just make it big O to the 8th. And then so because quantum can only do everything all at once, you just need to increase the complexity by 1 exponent to make it just as safe as it was before.
Yeah. And 1 order of magnitude in terms of exponentiation really doesn't change much, but it makes everything on the breaking the code side of it like almost infinitely more difficult. Yeah. Like right now with that encryption scheme, and every computer in the world, I remember reading somewhere that it'd take longer than the life of Earth, like
Correct.
The current life of Earth, to crack 128 or sorry, a 256-bit encryption.
Yes.
Yeah.
So to continue on with that, then, is it also because it's backed up by this Bitcoin organization that's kind of organizing?
Well,
like it's not exactly a fiat currency like a government issued currency, but it's like the idea of what's like, maybe this is like my non-new currency thinking, but usually currency needs to be backed up by something. Like right now, money is backed up by the kind of
the
faith
stock
in
market,
a way, and
yeah.
like stocks and like the GDP of the country that the money is coming from. In the past, it used to be because the state and the banks actually had like masses of gold and silver. So what's backing up Bitcoin's value?
I think that's a very interesting question. That's always the biggest complaint. People will be like, well, it's not really backed up by anything. Well, our fiat currency is really not backed up by anything tangible anymore either. And the answer is it's really not backed up by anything like most currencies today. I guess you could argue that it's backed up by the hash rate and that people are spending this amount of computer resources just to keep the network online, and so that gives an incentive for its price to at least be even to how much hashing power people are actually using. So that's just upgrading the equipment to do it. The electricity costs are definitely prohibitive. That's the major complaint you hear about people building mining rigs is how the heck do I get it so that I'm not essentially having electrical costs that are much more than the amount of value that I'm gaining from mining the currency itself, which depending on the country you're from or what you have access to becomes a major issue. But I think like with the first pizza that was bought with Bitcoins is what really started giving it value. Basically, you have a bunch of something and you say, well, I'll trade you this if you give me this, and somebody says, okay. I think there's a thought experiment that people have put into practice where they say you start with a paperclip and what can you trade up to, and there's these incredulous stories of people trading up to cars and things like that. They trade a paperclip for a pencil, and you trade the pencil for a pen, trade the pen for something slightly better, and then eventually you can get up to these larger and larger objects. So really, like, to say if it's backed up by anything as being a problem isn't necessarily the case.
How do you think use of Bitcoins would affect the economy?
That's
like the billion question.
That's probably like, I mean, I'm a computer scientist, so like I like to play with a lot of the math and the algorithms and stuff behind it. It's a very hard question for me to answer because I'm not an economist. From what I've seen, it's really affected. It seems like it could be a little bit more stable. You don't have situations where, well, I mean, Greece, I guess right now is an interesting example where they could technically bounce back their economy if they weren't in euros because they could just flood their own currency onto the market. But now that's not they can't do that. Whereas with cryptocurrencies, it's not. You can't suddenly create, so many millions of bitcoins. It's a formula. It has to be slowly solved over time.
Yeah. So like regular governments say, if we don't have enough money to cover certain costs or we don't have the ability to do certain things economically, they'll just flood the currency. They'll just make more dollars, which will make every dollar less valuable, but it kind of shifts the percentage of money that everybody owns, and so it's a way to kind of create more money. And it does, this is the kind of stuff that prevented the Depression, or that got us, like these are kind of measures that came in after the Depression, because money being strictly limited was one of the reasons why governments were not able to fund their own projects, and they fell apart in the Depression. And so if you had a world which was entirely reliant on Bitcoin, this is where I get nervous, is because it's again like a very limited currency, and so a government doesn't have that flexibility, and that would mean that they would be very strictly limited in the things that they could do, especially in economic hard times, which means that if they default, a country would just go bankrupt, and then there'd just be no government anymore. They wouldn't have the money to pick anything up. And this is the kind of problems that the Depression would happen in the Depression. So I can see it as like a between countries currency that's used by businesses or individuals, especially people who move from country to country a lot. But as if we're going to be doing all of our transactions in Bitcoins, that could be dangerous.
So I'm just curious, how far, so you said there's some debate about whether Bitcoin is a currency or not. Mm-hmm. How close to being a currency is it? And what I mean by that is, are there people who are employed and get paid in Bitcoin? Are there online stores readily available where you can go and buy whatever you want in Bitcoin?
Microsoft, for example, allows you to buy Xbox Gold with Bitcoins, which is actually surprising that they beat Google to it. But I want to say it's CNN or NBC. They had a report where a guy went and he bought $400 or $500 worth of Bitcoin, and he tried to live for an entire month on just Bitcoin in downtown New York. And it's not quite possible yet, but the fact that most of the people even listening to this really don't even know what Bitcoins are, that he was even able to mostly do it is a good sign.
Yeah, so what do you mean mostly? What limitations did he experience?
So he'd have to search around for a place to buy a coffee, whereas like right now you just go to any Tim Hortons if you're in Canada or whatever. So he'd have to go find a place that actually accepted Bitcoins. A lot of places he would go into, do you accept Bitcoins? They'd be like, we don't even know what that is. He found a couple, there was one bar that was really strange, the minimum purchase with a Bitcoin was like $50 American or something. And his explanation for it was really shoddy. You'd have to watch it to understand. Well, he'll go into why the explanation is shoddy too, but there's a lot of smaller mom-and-pop variety stores and that prefer Bitcoins because they don't get screwed with Visa bills and the banks taking the money off of the transactions. As long as they, at the end of the day, cash out their Bitcoins into US dollars, they know that that money is now securely in their pockets.
So if, say for the sake of argument, I'm living in New York and there's one of these mom and pop's convenience stores and I want to go and buy, I don't know, say $10 or $15 worth of stuff. Will state taxes be applied to my Bitcoin if I'm choosing to purchase in Bitcoin?
Well, that's a really interesting question because it becomes difficult. I think what most of them are doing is they're applying the taxes onto the Bitcoins and then they're transferring the taxes from the purchase when they've transferred it back to into American currency too.
Okay, so they're taxing the purchase in Bitcoins, converting the Bitcoins to US dollars, and then forwarding the tax on to whoever.
What they're doing is they'll put the whole purchase through, have the taxes on it, take whatever that is in USD, convert it to its current Bitcoin price as of that second, have you pay with Bitcoins, prove that you're not trying to double spend them, and then they'll, at the end of the day, transfer those from their Bitcoin accounts into US currency.
And another question I don't have. So Bitcoin's not alone. We talked a little bit earlier, before the show about things like Dogecoins, and there's a few competitors, and I'm wondering why is there these competitions are they noticeably different in different ways and
Well, there is a few differences. So Bitcoin became extremely hard for the normal user to mine because it relied on ASIC cards and things of the sort, or larger and larger warehouses. Some of the cryptocurrencies use a different type of encryption scheme called script, which is kind of based on I won't go into the details on that. And the idea is that they can change it so it becomes incredibly difficult to create a chip that will constantly mine for you, as they can use only GPUs to do it. And using GPUs to do it means that myself or Tyson could set up a mining machine to actually have it so it's even more distributed than it currently is with Bitcoins. Dogecoin is an interesting one because what originally was reported to be a bug in that it didn't have a hard limit like Bitcoins do, where eventually you won't be able to mine more out. It actually will just constantly have them go into the system. And some people like that because it sounds cool when you're like, oh, I'm going to give you 5,000 Dogecoin, whereas opposed to saying, I'm going to give you 0.000001 of a Bitcoin. For some reason, I don't know. People like whole numbers.
I imagine that if you just made names for those breakdowns.
Yeah,
whereas you said what the smallest
the
Bitcoin
smallest is always called a Satoshi. Yeah.
Satoshi, yeah. So if there's a potentially an infinite number of Dogecoins then. Correct. By that reasoning. So the same kind of thing could happen where the market floods with Dogecoin, and they all become worthless, right?
Except for the fact that the way that the cryptocurrencies work is that there's no way to flood the market. Someone would have to essentially be holding on to some astronomical amount of hash power and flood it into the Dogecoin system in one day for that to actually happen. Otherwise, the system will naturally increase the difficulty of solving a block with the current amount of hash power.
So it's the same kind of 10 minutes. If a block is solved in less than 10 minutes, you can make it harder.
Correct.
Okay. And you said years ago that this was possible to do. Like, how long ago should I have been starting to try to mine Bitcoins?
2009.
Darn.
Forever ago in computer time.
Forever ago. Well, that's too bad. So are there any other, like, one of the questions I wrote on my sheet was, can you make me money? So will these new currencies allow people to make money in terms of, like, trading and things like that?
Well, there definitely is a lack of, like with stocks, you can have options and things like that on top of that. There's absolutely nothing with Bitcoin for that, so that's an untapped market. The exchanges are always a big one. I'm sure you've heard of Mt. Gox, even though it was originally supposed to stand for Magic the Gathering Online Exchange, which got turned into a Bitcoin exchange. And they had actually, so when that one crashed, everyone's like, oh, that's the problem, Bitcoin's not safe. Well, no, they had actually implemented the protocol incorrectly. So the protocol for Bitcoin itself was fine. It was just that they did it wrong, and they suffered the consequences for it, which unfortunately was their exchange crashing. But there is a lot of different things that can be done in the future. People are talking about what are there ways to have contracts within Bitcoin. So like if you don't fulfill something, that you can prove without a third party that that person did or didn't fulfill their options, and then cancel the transaction or so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
It's very fast compared to most other currencies, which is very nice. You can transfer things within seconds and know that that's in your account. It cannot leave your account. No one can touch your account unless you give them the private key. But that's one of the issues where for the normal person, they're not going to necessarily hold their private key that well, which could be a problem because if somebody gets a hold of your private key, for all intents and purposes, they are the owner of that Bitcoin address and they can do whatever they want.
Interesting. Well, this has been eye-opening, I have to say. Like, I really should have had more computing power in 2009. Like,
Yeah.
why did I have a crappy
But it does
computer?
show that you can technically make money by doing math problems. You just have to do really, really hard ones.
Yes, yes. Well, thanks so much, Jordan, for coming on the show and telling us about the wonderful world of Bitcoin. It's been a very enlightening episode. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll be back live on CHRW 94.9 Western Radio here in 2 weeks, but our podcast will be next week as well. So keep tuning in, and we'll see you all later.
That's all for this week. If you want to send us some feedback, or if you want to come on the show yourself, email us at gradcastradio@gmail.com. Be sure to hook us up on social media. On Twitter, we're at GradcastRadio, and look up Gradcast Radio also on Facebook. If you want to subscribe to the podcast is located at gradcast.podbean.com, and it's on iTunes. And while you're there, why don't you leave us a review? It really helps us out. We'll see you guys next week.